Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Tuberville. Senator King, please.
Thank you. First, I want to welcome Senator Tuberville from the end of the row. He's now no longer at the end of the. Senator Tuberville, welcome to the end, from not being on the end of the row, as you have been very ably.
It got very lonely on that end,
well,
especially with this big room that we had. Thank you.
Mr. Zuckheim, first I want to thank you for your organization and leadership of the Reagan Defense Forum, which is a really important part of thinking through some of these strategic questions. Here's my question. It strikes me as you look back at the Ukraine conflict that if you combine the Ukrainians' will to fight with the resources of the West and the United States, Putin really in the long run doesn't stand a chance. It strikes me that Putin's best hope now is dividing the West and dividing the United States. Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
I absolutely think that's part of the Putin strategy. I think he also questions the will of the West to continue to support Ukraine for the long haul.
That's what I mean.
Absolutely, yes. I agree with that.
He wants to divide us, get us tired of the conflict, and then he's just going to win through the passage of time.
I think that's his approach, Senator. I agree.
And you mentioned, you used the word a few minutes ago, speedily. And one of my concerns is that, for example, with the tanks, our response has been slow, and then we have to go through training. And I'm worried right now at this moment that the Russians are preparing for a major offensive in the east that the Ukrainians aren't going to be ready for because they don't have the equipment. In other words, we've telegraphed to them that we don't have the tanks there yet, and they're going to try to take advantage of this gap. Is that something of concern?
Yes, Senator. I think the unclassified information I've reviewed certainly suggests that. And the way I think about it, Senator, is the strategy here is to help Ukraine realize a counteroffensive, to break through that Russian line that is emerging in the Donbass. To do that, we should give them all the capabilities necessary. Tanks is one example. Fourth-generation fighter aircraft is another. And we tend to think about the platform and get stuck rather than thinking about the strategy. If we trust Ukraine to restore its sovereign territory, then we should trust them with the platforms to do that and not worry they're going to use the platform for some other purpose or escalate the battle beyond the territory of Ukraine.
Have the Ukrainians been respectful of those limitations in terms of escalating the battle into Russia?
Best and I can tell, yes. There have been some debates, I believe, on the margins, but it's always been focused on within the sovereign territory of Ukraine.
Dr. Hill, I know you touched on this. It worries me, looking at a map yesterday, the Belarus border is about 60 miles from Kyiv. If I were Putin, I'd be very tempted to try to have another offensive toward Kyiv and the decapitation of the government. I take it you believe that Belarusian politics and the regional balance does not raise the level of risk of that happening.
Well, look, I think the risk is always there because, of course, Belarus and its President Lukashenko are very much dependent on Russia at this particular point. And, of course, there's an awful lot of troops there. But I think that the pressures inside Belarus, political pressures, would make it very difficult for Lukashenko to contemplate this. This would also be a huge alarm bell for all of the other former Soviet republics. I mean, if Belarus has been actually deployed in this war, I think we're going to see a pretty aggressive response from others as well. And
based upon the intelligence that we saw a year ago, we would know if the Russians were moving significant forces in that direction.
Yeah, we've seen build-up, getting back to what Senator Tuberville was talking about before, about the placement of men and equipment there. It looks like some of them are being trained. But we haven't seen, particularly at the moment, that we're expecting waves of people going over the Belarusian border. But we mustn't rule it out.
And in fact, that ties part of the strategy probably of those deployments is to tie the Ukrainians down to some extent, defending that border rather than putting all their forces in the east and the south. Absolutely, and Putin is at pains all the time to still raise the threat to Kyiv itself of another assault. And I think, getting back to what Mr. Zuckheim said before about not being sanguine about anything, actually, we have to be continuously vigilant and, continue to look at the intelligence about any of these contingencies. Dr. Lynn, final question. The key to the success thus far of the Ukrainians has been their amazing courage and will to fight. How do you assess the will to fight of the people of Taiwan and their leadership? Is there leadership of the Churchillian quality of Zelensky, or are they closer to, let's say, Ghani?
That's an excellent question, Senator. I think Taiwan is strengthening its will to fight. It's very encouraging for Taiwan to look at what Ukraine has accomplished, and it's instilling more confidence in the Taiwan people. I would also note that unlike Ukraine, where folks could leave via land, Taiwan is surrounded by water. So even if we're not necessarily seeing the strong will now, when push comes to shove, I think many people in Taiwan will find they have no escape routes and they need to fight for their home.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Scott, please.
Great, thanks. I want to thank each of you for being here. I come from Florida. We've got 21 bases and 3 unified commands. Military is a pretty big deal, especially in our panhandle, but all across our state. So you look at the Chinese spy balloon, you look at them building military to defeat us. You'd think that American citizens would start waking up and saying we ought to stop buying things from communist China, because it seems like they're taking the money they make to go eventually defeat us is what their goal. So I guess the first thing is, do you think Americans ought to stop buying things made in communist China? Because it ultimately flows to the Chinese Communist Party, and it can hurt us? I mean, what do y'all think?
Sure. So I think we definitely are, the U.S. government is already imposing significant restrictions on export of technology that could be used, as far as we know, to fuel military-civil fusion in China, as well as the PLA. With respect to technology below that, I think there is still a lot of advantage that Americans actually get from the cheaper products from China.
But doesn't China get a benefit?
For some of the more cheaper products, not as much, but definitely on the higher end, China is benefiting more. So if we need to disaggregate where we want to limit our exports to China and where exports to China or buying from China could actually benefit U.S. consumers and U.S. citizens.
Senator, I might add to that. I agree with the way Dr. Lin framed it. It's the strategic decoupling that's key. We have failed, and as you know, and you've led on this in the Senate, to make sure that we are not giving China the types of capabilities through our commerce that enhance the tip of the spear for part of their military. But we also have an interest in making China dependent on older technologies. And the scale of our exports to China in some ways could benefit us, but certainly on the military side, those elements, and I think we're seeing some good things out of the Bureau of Industry and Security and Commerce that are starting to put up walls, but it's taken way too long.
Do you think that China thinks we're getting weaker or stronger in relative to them? How do you think their leadership thinks?
What I've read and the way that they're planning is that they think they can beat us, particularly in the Taiwan scenario.
Right. What about, you read all this and what you hear is that how much time we're putting on having a woke military. It seems to me, I've always thought we ought to have, I served in the Navy, I thought our job was to be a lethal military, that people are scared to death of us. So do you think that, what do you think the government of Communist China thinks when they read that we're focused on pronouns and things like that, rather than how we have the most lethal military force?
Senator, I think the defense strategy is clear on this, and started with Secretary Mattis. We need to be focused on being the most lethal force, as you point out, focusing on the core mission. Anybody in the U.S. military wants to focus on their mission. We've done polling at the Reagan Institute with our Reagan National Defense Survey. Politicization is a problem. The American people have reduced trust and confidence in the military because they believe the military is politicized. And the more we can do to allow our military, our men and women in uniform, to focus on warfighting, the better it will be for our military and the more it will deter China.
I'd like to make a comment that, look, I'm afraid that the more that we have partisan and political fights, the more our adversaries think that we're weak. I've made that point many times in public before. They watch all of this, and frankly, they think we've lost it. So the more, I'm afraid, that we make statements like this, the more that we start attacking our fellow Americans for whatever perspective we think they come from, the more that Russia and China think that we're working ourselves out of history. They watch all of this very carefully, but not in the ways that you think. I think China and Russia do know that we still can be lethal, but we're most lethal when we get our act together and that we're all Americans fighting together on one side. And that's what our adversaries and our friends are looking to us. They would like us to get over all of these fights that we're having internally. And so, I mean, I would just urge us to, I don't honestly know what that label means. I try not to use labels. I think the more that we can stand up and just show that we're Americans in solidarity, the more we will be able to have a deterrent effect on our adversaries, and the more we'll bring our friends behind us, because they're watching us and thinking, you know, has America lost the plot at this moment?
So we stopped the vaccine mandate just recently in December. One of the issues I think a lot of us have been focused on is how do we reinstate people that were discharged, and how do we make sure they're not put in an adverse monetary position. We have a problem with retention. We have a problem with recruitment. So how much do you think it would be important that we let people come back in that for religious or health reasons decide not to take the vaccine, or and also make sure that they don't have to pay back back pay, they don't have to pay for training, things like that.
Readiness is key here. We, as you know, we're not meeting our numbers, and so I believe this Congress has given authority to the Secretary of Defense and Department of Defense to do just that, and it's about execution now at the state. Senator Scott.
And if I could add, one major advantage that our military has over the PLA is the quality of our personnel. If you look at what President Xi Jinping has mentioned in terms of priorities for the PLA, after military theory and organization, the second priority is development of the PLA personnel, and equipment comes after that.
Yep. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Scott. And for the information of my colleagues, there are 2 votes beginning at 11:30. Senator Manchin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. I'm so sorry. I had another meeting I had to speak at, and I'm sure you probably covered this in generality, but I'd like to ask the questions again. First of all, I think what I'm hearing loud and clear is if we have laundry that is dirty and need washed, don't do it in the public when the military is involved. I'm hearing that loud and clear, which probably any time we have military conversations or disagreement, it should be done in the skiff with all 100 of us there so we can talk about it to each other and how we come out of there unified. So that's a clear message you're giving us, and you ought to continue to give that. I feel very strongly about that. Next of all, I'd like, Dr. Lin, I'll start with you. First of all, does the Taiwanese have the ability to defend themselves against mainland China, to be independent? And if not, would they have the ability with the United States' help? And if it took the United States' help, would we have any allies coming with us to defend Taiwan the way that they have come together in Europe on Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So to be frank, Taiwan would not be able to stand by itself.
It cannot defend itself, no matter what we do, no matter what equipment we give them.
When you're talking about a large-scale invasion, given the vast power disparities that China can bring to bear, Taiwan would not be able to stand alone.
Okay.
Yes.
Can they do it with our help? Are we able to deter that, or just basically prolong it?
Yes, so I think that is what the department is focused on with Taiwan as the pacing scenario, to make sure that the United States can be able to flow enough assets and have the right both posture, capabilities, as well as operational competence.
I'm understanding there's a little bit of a difference of what we believe that they would need to defend themselves and be successful versus what they desire to have.
So when Taiwan thinks about its defense needs, it's thinking not only about the high-end contingency of the Chinese invasion, it's also thinking about the day-to-day gray zone incursions that China is flying into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So from their perspective, they need to cover all the different threats.
Okay. And how about allies? Which allies would come to the defense that look at Taiwan and the commitment other than the U.S.? I have not heard of other allies believing that it's of national interest to them to go and fight or support a Taiwanese war against China.
So we are increasingly hearing from Japan that the defense of Taiwan is also vital to Japanese national security, and that's why the critical national security documents, the new documents that came out in December from Japan's end, reflect the seriousness that Japan takes for its problem.
How about South Korea?
I would put South Korea lower than potentially Australia and other. So Japan, I would put Japan
the highest.
Australia. South Korea would be a bit lower than that.
Okay.
And the Philippines would probably be somewhere between Australia and South Korea.
And we're putting much effort in the Philippines right now trying to build that up. Okay. And Dr. Hill, Ukraine. Does Ukraine have the ability to fight and win the war to take back the Donbass and also Crimea?
Well, it's not just Donbass and Crimea, it's also these other two
Yeah,
regions as well of Kherson
Sure.
and Zaporizhia.
I mean, basically putting their
I know.
country back.
It very much, as we've been talking before, depends on the provision of military assistance from the United States and other allies, and also a diplomatic effort too. I mean, I think you're just primarily on the battlefield, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult because, you know, we've already had a discussion about how much the Russians have dug in at this particular point. So we need to have diplomacy pushing alongside the military. I can't honestly say about whether it's feasible for Ukraine. There's differences of opinion in the United States, UK, and among other European allies.
Are you all gauging the support of the Russian citizens towards this fight? They believe it's an honorable fight, it's a needed fight, it's one that they have to put their country and take back?
This is being put to the test. What Putin's trying to tell the Russians at the moment is this is the third patriotic war after Napoleon's invasion, Nazis' invasion. I mean, this is ridiculous of Russia, the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Now this is the next invasion.
Really?
I don't think all Russians are buying this. We've seen 1 million people leave, and I'm not convinced myself that another additional 500,000 people are willing to be sacrificed on the front lines of what is, to some extent, a vanity project for Vladimir Putin.
And you think the Ukrainians have the willpower and the people power to continue this
They
fight?
certainly have the willpower. The people power is under some stress at the moment because of the sheer numbers that Russia is trying to push to the battlefield. We're aware of that, which is why, as Mrs. Akheim has been saying, it's very important to outweigh that with equipment. But again, diplomatic support is going to be crucial. It won't be just one on the battlefield, this war for Ukraine.
Yeah, but diplomatic, I'm always concerned that the United States might intervene or the Europeans put so much pressure on to go to the negotiating table, and Putin's going to walk away with a win no matter if he loses. He'll walk away with a propaganda win.
I have exactly the same concerns, which is why we have to really step up our diplomacy with other countries to make very clear how unacceptable it is to have Putin get away with what is a violation
My final
of
part, because I'm
international
running
law.
out of time, I know, I'm so
Yeah.
sorry, if I may, sir. Basically, the will for our allies to stay into this fight, are they going to be forced back as energy independence or energy security or a lack of it or a need of the Russian energy, cheap energy they've had before? Is that going to force maybe this to a table or to a resolve prior to where it needs to be?
This is much less of a factor than it was before. I think actually you'll find that Europeans' resolve is much stronger than perhaps is often seen from here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Mullen, please.
Thank you, Chairman. And just for
Senator
comment
Manchin.
purposes, I want to say if there's any way I could get a list of promotions before we vote on them, because I think I just voted on my brother-in-law to be promoted, and I want the ability to maybe put a hold on him before I do that. I like him sometimes, but not always.
Absolutely. You have to go through 1,700 names.
That's fine. I'll find him pretty quick.
No, that's no problem.
Anyways, I appreciate the opportunity to serve on this committee, and I want to go straight to, and sir, forgive me if I mess your name, but Zakim?
Zakheim, but I'll take Zakim.
Say that again?
Zakheim.
Zakheim. All right, Zakheim. In 2022, the National Defense Strategy Briefing mentioned our enemy's use of irregular warfare as a way to destabilize our allies and undermine our conventional military power. Can you speak of the effects of Russia's energy warfare that's had on Europe's resolve and the allies in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and I want to associate myself with what Dr. Hill just said, where they absolutely tried to intimidate and browbeat the Europeans in submission on the basis of turning off the spigots and, energy warfare is really what it came down to. And I think in this regard, Europe, I guess from my standpoint, surprised me. They've diversified, and as recently as you may be aware, Senator, Vladimir Putin is now going to reduce production because he hasn't seen the effects of this form of warfare. So I think it's actually been a good news story to date.
Well, I've said this multiple times that U.S. energy independence brings on global stabilization. People want to do business with the United States. And Dr. Hill, you made a reference that we should be trying to help our allies more with food, fuel, and fertilizer. The problem is that underneath this current administration, the war on energy, even the president's comments just recently that he's wanting to eliminate fossil fuels within 10 years, it causes problems with our allies. Would you agree?
Well, it depends on how we're framing all of that. I mean, part
Well,
of
if we cut fossil fuels, you're going to damage food supply. As a rancher, someone that produces a lot of protein for the American people, I can't run my tractors and our semis on electricity.
Yeah.
And if I could, it would cost 2 or 3 more times to buy that product, which there's not the margin in there. So it's going to hurt the food supply. Fertilizer, my Lord,
yeah.
we saw the effects of that last year.
Yeah.
So when you make that comment, it would have to have reverse effects on our allies, wouldn't it? Because they'd have to depend on somebody else for that.
Well, look, you're absolutely right in making this distinction, and I'm glad you did, because, of course, 70% of food production is fuel, just as you've pointed out. And it's not electricity, it's actually the fuel that's in the major equipment, but it's also for making fertilizer, because all the ammonia phosphates and, fertilizers are used with natural gas. So we have to, what I was going to say is we have to have a very sensible discussion about all of this. There's another dimension beyond the fuel, fertilizer, food mix, which you've quite rightly pointed out, which is of nuclear energy too.
Absolutely.
We haven't put this in the mix. And Vladimir Putin has, of course, imperiled civilian nuclear power by attacks on the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, going through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. We've been dependent on Russia for some of the fuel supply system for nuclear fuel. This is a time for us to step up into this realm as well. I think, possibly for this committee and many others, we should be having a very sensible, open discussion on the complexities of this issue and how to balance it off.
Thank you. I agree. Sir, what lessons should we learn from Russia's irregular warfares?
Well, I mean, they've been effective with hybrid warfare, as you note, in Georgia, in Crimea. In this case, Putin was perhaps overconfident in his conventional forces capability and didn't pursue that route. Although I would note that the day before Russia had the physical land invasion of Ukraine, there were robust cyber attacks on Ukraine, on their government servers, and actually globally. And so we have to think of this conflict as one that's playing out in all domains, including, I think, what you're characterizing as the irregular domain as well. And, the notion that we're in some sort of steady state, either peace or conflict, the reality is that there are elements of our of military domains right now that are an active conflict, cyber being the primary example.
Thank you. And, sir, with the fact that I came over from the House and we respect the time because we get cut off, I'm going to yield back the remainder of my time to you.
Thank you. That is an example that everyone should follow.
I
And
agree.
I
I
thank
agree.
Senator Mullen. You've added so much to the committee already.
You'll go to